The moment they walked into the grand dining room, the entire ship seemed to hold its breath. Michael had his hand resting possessively on the small of Brooke's back, guiding her through the softly lit space as if she belonged there. She wore a striking red dress that clung to her youthful figure, her dark hair cascading over one shoulder. They were laughing, quietly lost in their private world. Then Michael's eyes met mine across the room. His smile vanished instantly. Brooke followed his gaze, and her face drained of color. Beside me, Dr. Jonathan Hale raised his glass in a calm, deliberate toast. The four of us locked eyes in that elegant space filled with crystal chandeliers and the gentle hum of conversation. 28 years of marriage reduced to this single devastating tableau. My husband and his young mistress on a luxury Caribbean cruise, and me sitting there with her husband composed and ready. It had begun 6 days earlier on an ordinary Tuesday morning. The confirmation email arrived at 11:47 a.m., nestled between a dentist reminder and a note from our financial advisor about rebalancing our retirement portfolio. The subject line read, Azure Seas Luxury Cruises 7-Night Caribbean Escape. I nearly archived it as spam until I saw my husband's name. Michael Harrington, Owner's Suite. Departing Miami this Saturday. Champagne sunrise breakfast on the balcony. Private butler service. And listed clearly as the second guest, Brooke Sinclair. I sat motionless at our kitchen island, the cool marble surface grounding me, while my coffee grew cold beside the laptop. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching on the same crystal vase I'd filled with fresh flowers just yesterday. Outside, the lawn crew moved with their usual quiet efficiency, trimming the hedges that bordered our carefully maintained yard. Everything appeared exactly as it had 10 minutes before, yet beneath my feet. The foundation of my life had shifted with surgical precision. Michael had told me he needed to be in Chicago for an important board meeting followed by a quick golf trip with clients. He had even grumbled about the early flight and packed his clubs the night before. I remembered kissing his cheek at the door, wishing him safe travels while he checked his phone one last time. The normal rhythm of our marriage, 28 years of routines, shared responsibilities, and quiet companionship had felt intact. Now this. I opened the attached itinerary with steady fingers. Sunset dinner on the private island, couples massage at the spa, a private jewelry shopping excursion in St. Thomas. Every detail spoke of deliberate planning, the kind Michael once reserved for our anniversary trips before the children grew up and moved away. Emily was married and settled in Austin with her own family. Tyler was pursuing his doctorate in Boston. The house had grown too quiet, I realized. Too quiet for a man like Michael. Apparently. Brooke Sinclair, 29 years old, the marketing coordinator from the firm his company had acquired last year. I had met her briefly at the holiday party, tall, confident, with a bright laugh that turned heads. She had addressed Michael as Mr. Harrington with a perfect blend of professionalism and subtle admiration. At the time, it had seemed harmless. Now, every small memory rewrote itself in sharper focus. I logged into our shared family cloud account, the one we had created years ago for travel documents, photos, and important papers. He had forgotten to remove my access from the automatic forwarding. A careless oversight. Or perhaps the quiet arrogance of a man who believed he could maintain 2 separate lives without consequence. Clicking through the reservation details, I noted the payment had come from his personal business account, not our joint one. Another deliberate choice. The owner's suite wasn't just luxurious, it was the most expensive option on the ship, designed for those who wanted to impress. I imagined him describing it to her, promising an escape from everyday responsibilities. For several long minutes, I simply sat there breathing. There was no dramatic outburst, no flood of tears. Instead, a strange crystalline clarity settled over me. 28 years, 2 children, countless shared milestones. All of it balanced against this single calculated betrayal. I wasn't angry in the explosive way people expect. I felt something deeper, disappointment mixed with resolve. Michael had chosen this path. Now I would choose mine. I began taking meticulous notes in a new document. Flight details, cabin number, excursion bookings. I cross-referenced Brooke's social media and professional profiles with quiet efficiency. Then I searched for her husband. Dr. Jonathan Hale, respected cardiac surgeon. Their wedding photos from 4 years ago still appeared in occasional posts. He looked steady and accomplished, the kind of man who likely worked long hours believing in the future they were building. By early afternoon I had composed a careful message and sent it through his hospital's secure contact system. Short, factual, and impossible to ignore. Dr. Hale, I believe our spouses are planning a trip together next week aboard the Azure Seas. I have full documentation. We should speak privately. His reply came faster than I expected, within 40 minutes. We arranged to meet the following day at a quiet cafe well outside our usual circles. That night when Michael called from Chicago, his voice carried the familiar mix of warmth and distraction. I responded with the same measured tone I had used for years. Safe travels, I told him. Enjoy your golf. He had no idea the ground was already moving beneath him. The next afternoon, Jonathan Hale arrived exactly on time. Tall silver, threading his dark hair with the precise movements of a surgeon. His handshake was firm, his eyes steady despite the exhaustion etched around them. We ordered coffee and sat across from each other like professionals discussing a difficult case. She told me it was a girls' trip with college friends, he said quietly, his voice controlled. I even helped her pack. I slid the printed cruise confirmation across the small table. He read every line with clinical focus. When he reached Brooke's name listed beneath Michael's, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he remained composed. We spoke for nearly 2 hours, not with tears or accusations, but with clear-eyed precision. By the time we stood to leave, an alliance had formed, not born of friendship, but of necessity and mutual respect. We would not confront them immediately. We would join the cruise instead. I booked the owner's suite directly across the corridor from theirs. Jonathan secured a grand suite 1 deck below, though he would join me in the public spaces. We aligned our excursions and dinner times where possible. The plan was simple presence. Quiet, undeniable presence. As I drove home that evening, the late sunlight filtered through the trees lining our street. Our house looked the same, elegant, well-maintained, filled with the artifacts of a shared life. But I saw it differently now. Not as a home I was losing, but as a chapter whose final pages were being written. Michael wanted a fantasy. I would deliver reality instead, calmly, methodically, and without losing my dignity. The cruise departed in 5 days. By then, everything would be in place. The meeting with Jonathan lasted well into the afternoon. We lingered over coffee in that unassuming cafe, 2 strangers bound by the same unwelcome revelation. He spoke with the measured precision of a surgeon who had delivered difficult news many times before. I listened, offering my own observations without embellishment. There were no theatrical declarations of anger or vows of revenge. Instead, we mapped out logistics the way one might plan a complex project calmly and thoroughly. I don't want chaos, Jonathan said, turning his cup slowly in his hands. Brooke thrives on drama when cornered. I'd rather she face the consequences she chose to ignore. I nodded, appreciating his clarity. At 51, he carried the quiet confidence of a man who had built his career on steady hands and clear decisions. His silver temples and the faint lines around his eyes spoke of long hours in the operating room and the weight of expectations. He asked practical questions about the ship's layout, the excursions Michael had booked, and how we might position ourselves without creating public scenes. I shared the details I had gathered, including cabin 1026, the owner's suite, and its exact location on deck 10. By the time we left the cafe, the plan had taken solid form. I would book the owner's suite directly across the corridor, 1028. Jonathan secured a spacious grand suite 1 deck below, but planned to spend most evenings and key activities in the public areas with me. We synchronized our dinner reservations and excursion selections. The goal was never to hide. We would simply exist in their space with dignity and composure. The next few days passed in a blur of quiet preparation. I told Michael over the phone that I planned to visit my sister in Atlanta for the week, a story he accepted without much question. His responses were distracted, eager to end the call. I packed with deliberate care, elegant linen dresses, a deep emerald gown for formal night, comfortable yet refined pieces that reflected the woman I had become over 28 years. Each item folded into the suitcase felt like a small assertion of control. Jonathan and I exchanged a few more messages, professional and concise. He sent me additional details he had uncovered about Brooke's recent spending and travel patterns. In return, I forwarded the full itinerary. There was an unexpected comfort in this collaboration. We were not seeking solace in each other, but we understood the terrain we were about to enter. Two people who had built substantial lives now confronting the fragility of trust. On the morning of departure, Miami greeted me with thick humidity and brilliant sunlight. The cruise terminal buzzed with energy families, wheeling luggage couples posing for photos, porters moving with practiced efficiency. I moved through check-in with quiet confidence, my cream linen dress crisp and my pearls understated. Jonathan had already boarded and confirmed via text that Michael and Brooke were on the ship. I stepped into the owner's suite and closed the door behind me. The space was breathtaking, a generous living area, a marble bathroom larger than some hotel rooms, and an expansive private balcony overlooking the harbor. Sunlight danced across the water, casting shifting patterns on the pale walls. I unpacked slowly, hanging dresses in the closet and arranging toiletries with care. Through the corridor walls, I caught faint sounds, laughter, the rolling of a suitcase. Michael's familiar, deep voice saying something I couldn't quite make out. A strange calm settled over me as I stepped onto the balcony. The ship's horn sounded low and resonant, signaling the final call for boarding. Below, passengers streamed up the gangway. Somewhere among them, my husband walked beside a woman nearly half his age, believing this week belonged only to them. I watched the harbor activity, feeling the gentle vibration of the engines beneath my feet. The air carried salt and possibility. Jonathan joined me briefly in the atrium later that afternoon. He looked distinguished in a navy blazer, his posture straight despite the tension I could sense beneath it. We spoke softly near a grand piano, two acquaintances enjoying the start of a cruise. "They're in 1026, he confirmed. I saw them enter the corridor. Brooke was excited about the butler service. I offered a small, steady smile. "Then let's give them the full experience." We agreed on our first appearance, the main dining room that evening. No direct approach, simply being present. As Jonathan returned to his suite to change, I stood at the railing on the upper deck watching Miami's skyline recede. The warm breeze tugged at my hair. 28 years of marriage had taught me many things: patience, resilience, the value of composure under pressure. Those lessons would serve me now. Back in my suite, I chose a sophisticated navy dress for dinner, one that accentuated my figure without trying too hard. I applied makeup with a steady hand, studying my reflection. There were lines around my eyes that hadn't been there in my 30s, but they belonged to a life fully lived. I wasn't competing with Brooke's youth. I was presenting the woman Michael had chosen to betray. At 7:30, I made my way to the grand dining room. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over white tablecloths and polished silver. Soft music played in the background. I selected a table with a clear view of the main entrance and ordered a glass of crisp Sauvignon Blanc. Jonathan arrived minutes later and sat across from me. We conversed naturally about the ship's amenities and the upcoming ports, our voices carrying just enough to blend with the surrounding chatter. Then, at 7:40, they walked in. Michael looked relaxed in a tailored shirt, his hand resting lightly on Brooke's lower back. She wore that striking red dress, her youthful confidence on full display, as she leaned slightly into him. They were smiling at each other, sharing some private joke, the picture of a romantic escape. Michael's gaze swept the room and landed on our table. The transformation was instantaneous. His hand dropped from Brooke's back. His face went rigid, color draining from his cheeks. Brooke turned, following his stare, and froze mid-step. Her bright expression shattered. I lifted my glass in a small, polite gesture of acknowledgement. Jonathan turned his head just enough for them to see him clearly. For several long seconds, the four of us remained connected across the elegant dining room, the air thick with unspoken truths. Michael's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Brooke's fingers tightened around her clutch. They were shown to a table on the far side of the room, but the damage was done. The fantasy had cracked the moment it met reality. I took a slow sip of wine, feeling the cool liquid steady me. Jonathan met my eyes across the table, his expression composed, but carrying a shared understanding. The first night at sea had only just begun, and already the carefully constructed illusion was beginning to unravel. The rest of that first evening unfolded with the kind of deliberate normalcy that only heightened the underlying tension. After the initial shock in the dining room, Michael and Brooke were seated at a table near the windows, far enough to offer the illusion of privacy, but close enough for us to remain unmistakably present. Jonathan and I continued our meal at a measured pace, discussing the ship's itinerary and the quality of the wine list, as if this were any other vacation. We didn't stare. We didn't need to. Our mere presence spoke volumes. I caught occasional glances from Michael, quick disbelieving looks that he tried to mask by focusing on his menu. Brooke sat with rigid posture, her earlier confidence dimmed. She picked at her appetizer, her laughter now absent. The young woman who had boarded, believing she was stepping into a week of secret luxury, now found herself sharing the same elegant space with the two people whose lives she had helped disrupt. After dinner, Jonathan and I took a stroll along the promenade deck. The night air was warm and salted, carrying the faint sound of waves against the hull as the ship cut through the dark Caribbean waters. String lights twinkled overhead, and soft music drifted from nearby lounges. We walked side by side without touching, two professionals navigating unfamiliar territory with quiet dignity. They looked rattled. Jonathan observed, his voice low but steady. Brooke hates being caught off guard. She prefers control. I nodded, watching the distant lights of another vessel on the horizon. Michael always believed he could manage multiple worlds. Tonight, those worlds collided. We didn't dwell on them. Instead, we spoke briefly about our children, his two sons in college, my Emily and Tyler, and the strange symmetry of empty nest lives suddenly upended. There was no rush toward intimacy or alliance beyond necessity. We simply understood each other in a way few others could. I returned to my suite around 10. The owner's suite felt even more spacious at night, with the balcony doors open to the sea breeze. I poured a small glass of sparkling water from the minibar and stepped outside. The ship hummed gently beneath me, a steady vibration that matched the quiet resolve building in my chest. Through the corridor, faint sounds drifted from cabin 1026, muffled voices, the occasional rise and fall of conversation. I didn't strain to listen, but the thin walls made fragments unavoidable. Michael's tone carried that defensive edge I recognized from past disagreements. Brooke's replies were sharper, younger, less practiced at containing frustration. Sleep came slowly that night. I lay in the king-sized bed, staring at the elegant ceiling panels, replaying the dining room moment. 28 years. I had supported Michael's career through late nights and risky ventures. I had raised our children while managing our home and social obligations. I had been the steady partner, the one who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, who kept the fabric of our life intact. And yet here I was on a luxury cruise I hadn't chosen, confronting a betrayal wrapped in champagne and ocean views. Morning arrived, with brilliant sunlight flooding the balcony. I dressed in lightweight linen pants and a soft blouse, choosing comfort with quiet elegance. Jonathan texted that he would meet me for breakfast at the Lido Deck Cafe. As I stepped into the corridor, the door to 1026 opened. Michael emerged first, looking slightly disheveled despite his expensive polo shirt. Our eyes met. "Laura," he said, voice tight and low, "we need to talk." I offered a small, polite smile. "Of course. There's plenty of time this week." Brooke appeared behind him, her face pale beneath carefully applied makeup. She avoided my gaze entirely. I continued toward the elevators without another word, leaving them standing in the doorway of their fantasy. Jonathan was already at a corner table overlooking the pool when I arrived. We selected fresh fruit yogurt and strong coffee, speaking easily about the day's private island excursion. The plan was working as intended, not loud confrontation, but steady, inescapable presence. The tender boat to the private island was smooth and sunny. Jonathan and I boarded early and chose seats near the front. When Michael and Brooke arrived, they had little choice but to sit a few rows behind us. I felt their eyes on the back of my head throughout the short ride. The island itself was postcard-perfect white sand, turquoise water palm trees swaying in the breeze. We claimed loungers near the gentle surf, arranging towels and ordering chilled drinks from attentive staff. Michael and Brooke settled farther down the beach, but the island was small enough that avoidance was impossible. After an hour, Michael walked over his bare feet, kicking up sand. Brooke trailed reluctantly behind him. "This is insane, Laura," he said, keeping his voice down. "What are you doing here?" I looked up from my book, shielding my eyes with one hand. "Enjoying a well-deserved vacation, the same as you." Jonathan rose slowly and stood beside me, his presence solid and calm. "Hello, Brooke." She flinched at the sound of her husband's voice, but managed a weak nod. The four of us stood in an awkward square under the bright Caribbean sun. No raised voices, no accusations flung across the sand, just the quiet weight of truth pressing down on their romantic escape. Michael tried again. "We can discuss this like adults when we get home." "We are adults," I replied evenly. "And we're discussing it now in the environment you chose." Brooke shifted uncomfortably, her toes digging into the sand. For the first time, she looked truly young, uncertain, and exposed. Jonathan watched her with the same clinical composure he likely used in the operating room, offering neither comfort nor anger, just clarity. We didn't linger. Jonathan and I returned to our loungers, reading and occasionally swimming in the clear water. The pressure wasn't dramatic. It was constant, like the tide gradually reshaping the shoreline. By late afternoon, when the tender returned us to the ship, the easy intimacy between Michael and Brooke had visibly frayed. They walked several feet apart, their conversation sparse and tense. That evening, as I prepared for another dinner, I felt a quiet strength settling into my bones. This wasn't about winning or humiliating them. It was about refusing to disappear, about standing in my truth with the same dignity I had brought to every other chapter of my life. The first full day at sea had only begun, and the week stretched ahead with deliberate possibility. The private island had set the tone, but the real weight of our presence began to settle during the days that followed. By the second full day at sea, the ship's rhythm felt almost familiar, the gentle roll of the waves, the soft chime announcing activities, the scent of sunscreen and ocean air mingling in every corridor. Jonathan and I moved through it with quiet purpose, never chasing Michael and Brooke, but never retreating either. That afternoon we joined the snorkeling excursion at the second port. The water was exceptionally clear, sunlight piercing through to reveal vibrant coral and darting fish. I adjusted my mask and slipped into the warm sea beside Jonathan. A short distance away, Michael and Brooke entered the water. For a while the ocean offered a temporary buffer, but when we surfaced near the same reef, there was no avoiding the encounter. Michael treaded water a few yards away, his hair slicked back, breathing harder than the mild current required. Brooke floated nearby, her youthful energy tempered by obvious discomfort. Jonathan nodded politely in their direction, before turning back to point out a school of brightly colored fish. The four of us bobbed in the same turquoise expanse, the vast ocean somehow making the space between us feel smaller. Later, back on the ship's sun deck, Michael approached while Brooke lingered at the bar. He looked tired, the tropical sun doing little to hide the strain around his eyes. At 54, he still carried himself with the confidence of a successful businessman, but cracks were showing in the facade. "Laura, this has gone far enough," he said, keeping his voice low as he stood beside my lounger. "You're making a spectacle." I set down my book and looked up at him, shielding my eyes from the glare. "A spectacle? I'm simply enjoying the cruise you planned so carefully. Owner's suite, private excursions, champagne breakfasts. It all sounded wonderful in the confirmation email." He flinched at the mention of the email. "Brooke and I... It's not what you think. This was supposed to be private." I finished calmly. "Yes, I gathered that from the separate credit card charges and the story about Chicago." Jonathan joined us then, a towel draped over one shoulder, his surgical precision evident even in swim trunks. He didn't interrupt aggressively. He simply stood there, a steady presence that seemed to deflate Michael further. Brooke approached hesitantly, clutching a colorful cocktail like a shield. Up close, she looked even younger than her 29 years, her makeup slightly smudged from the water. She glanced at Jonathan, then quickly away, unable to hold his gaze. "Jonathan," she said softly, almost pleading, "can we talk alone?" He studied her for a long moment, the man who had once promised her forever now seeing her with unflinching clarity. "We can talk when you're ready to be honest." Not before. The exchange was brief, civil, and devastating in its restraint. No shouting, no tears in front of strangers. Just 4 people standing on a sun-drenched deck while the fantasy they had built crumbled under the weight of reality. Michael reached for Brooke's hand, but she pulled away slightly, her fingers tightening around her glass instead. That evening, the arguments in cabin 1026 grew more audible. I sat on my balcony with a cup of herbal tea as the ship sailed toward the next port. The thin walls carried fragments, Brooke's voice rising with frustration, Michael's replies defensive and increasingly impatient. "You said this would be simple," she accused at one point. His response was muffled, but the tension vibrated through the corridor like a live wire. I didn't feel triumphant listening to it. Instead, I felt a profound sense of clarity. 28 years of marriage had included good times raising Emily and Tyler, building a home, supporting each other through challenges. But those years had also revealed Michael's pattern when life grew quiet or demanding he sought excitement elsewhere. This time he had chosen someone young enough to be our daughter's contemporary, believing luxury, and secrecy could sustain it. Jonathan met me for a nightcap in a quiet lounge on deck 11. We chose a corner table away from the music. He looked composed, but I noticed the way his hand tightened slightly around his glass of scotch. "She asked if I still loved her," he said after a while. "I told her love without respect is just attachment." She didn't like that answer. I nodded, understanding more than I could express. Michael keeps saying it was a mistake, as if planning an entire luxury cruise for his mistress was something that happened by accident. We sat in companionable silence for some time, watching couples dance on the small floor. There was comfort in this shared vantage point, 2 people who had given much to their marriages now refusing to let betrayal define their worth. Jonathan wasn't looking for a new romance any more than I was. We were simply anchoring each other through an uncomfortable but necessary storm. The following morning brought another layered collision during the ship's trivia session. The host encouraged larger teams, and when Michael and Brooke tried to sit at a distant table, Jonathan and I were invited to join a group that included them. Social etiquette left little room for refusal. We sat across from each other at the long table, answering questions about history, movies, and geography with polite contributions. Michael's usual charm faltered when a question about classic love stories arose. Brooke shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I answered one correctly about a famous Caribbean novel, my voice steady. Each small interaction added another thread to the web of discomfort surrounding them. No dramatic accusations, just the relentless mirror of our presence reflecting back the choices they had made. By the time the session ended, Brooke excused herself, quickly claiming a headache. Michael lingered a moment longer, his eyes meeting mine with a mixture of regret and irritation. "You've made your point, Laura," he said quietly as others dispersed. "Have I?" I replied. "Because from where I'm sitting, the point is only beginning to land." He walked away without another word. Jonathan and I remained at the table a while longer, finishing our drinks. The ship continued its steady course through azure waters, but inside cabin 1026 and across the dining rooms and decks, the illusion of a carefree romantic escape had been thoroughly dismantled. The pressure was working not through force, but through the simple, powerful act of refusing to vanish. The following days settled into a rhythm of deliberate presence that proved far more effective than any confrontation could have been. The ship moved smoothly from port to port, each new island offering another stage where our paths inevitably crossed. Jonathan and I never pursued them yet. We appeared with quiet consistency at breakfast buffets around the pool during scheduled activities. The pressure built slowly, like the Caribbean sun rising higher each hour, impossible to ignore. On the morning of day 4, I entered the main dining area for breakfast, and found Michael and Brooke already seated near the windows. They looked less polished than on the first evening. Michael's shoulders carried visible tension, while Brooke stared into her coffee with distant eyes. When Jonathan and I chose a table directly in their line of sight, Michael's fork paused midway to his mouth. I offered a small nod of acknowledgement. The same polite greeting one might give acquaintances at a country club, nothing more. We ordered avocado toast and fresh tropical fruit. As the waiter poured coffee, Brooke glanced our way again. Her youthful glow had dimmed noticeably. The carefree mistress enjoying stolen luxury now seemed burdened by the reality of two marriages colliding in real time. Jonathan ate calmly, occasionally sharing observations about the upcoming port. Our conversation flowed naturally, never loud enough to disturb others, yet positioned perfectly for them to witness two people handling betrayal with composure. Later that morning we joined the same snorkeling group they had booked. The water was warm and inviting, filled with schools of silver fish that darted through shafts of sunlight. I swam a short distance from Michael, who kept stealing glances in my direction. When we surfaced near the boat ladder, Brooke was already climbing aboard, her movements hurried. Michael lingered in the water a moment longer. "Laura," he said quietly, treading water beside me. "I never wanted to hurt you like this." I adjusted my mask, meeting his eyes steadily. "Yet here we are, on the cruise you planned with such care. Tell me, Michael, does the reality match the fantasy you sold yourself?" He had no immediate answer. The waves lapped gently between us as other passengers climbed aboard. Jonathan waited on the deck, offering me a hand as I ascended the ladder. The small gesture of support, witnessed by both Michael and Brooke, carried its own quiet weight. No drama, just the steady reminder that life continued with or without their secret intact. That afternoon at the pool deck, the encounters grew more layered. I was reading under a shaded cabana when Brooke approached hesitantly, a towel clutched in her hands. She looked younger in the bright sunlight, almost vulnerable. Jonathan sat nearby with a book close enough to observe, but far enough to give the moment space. "Can I sit for a minute?" she asked, her voice softer than I expected. I gestured to the empty chair. "Of course." She perched on the edge, clearly uncomfortable. "This wasn't supposed to happen like this. I don't know what I thought." I studied her for a moment, seeing not just the other woman, but a person who had made choices with consequences she was only now fully grasping. "None of us plan for reality to intrude on our illusions, Brooke, yet it always does." Jonathan didn't interrupt. He simply closed his book and watched with the same clinical patience he brought to the operating room. Brooke's eyes flicked toward him, then away. The silence stretched, filled only by the sounds of laughter from children splashing in the pool and the distant call of a bartender. She stood after a few minutes, murmuring something about needing sunscreen, and walked away. Her shoulders remained hunched long after she left. Michael found me later on the upper promenade deck as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. The sky blazed in shades of orange and pink, painting the water in liquid gold. He leaned on the railing beside me, the breeze tugging at his shirt. "I made a stupid mistake," he admitted, voice rough. "A midlife crisis, whatever you want to call it. She made me feel young again, alive in a way I hadn't felt in years." I kept my gaze on the horizon. "And now, does this cruise still feel worth it?" He exhaled heavily. "The arguments never stop. She's angry that you're here. I'm angry at myself. Everything's falling apart." "Good," I said quietly, without malice. "Falling apart is the first step toward seeing things clearly." He looked at me, then really looked the way he hadn't in a long time. The man I had built a life with, raised children with, supported through business ups and downs. For a fleeting moment I saw regret there, genuine and raw. But regret alone wasn't enough. Not after the calculated planning, the secret credit card, the lies about Chicago. That night, the sounds from cabin 1026 grew sharper. Voices carried clearly through the walls. Brooke's frustration rising, Michael's defensive tone cracking under pressure. I sat on my balcony with a light shawl against the evening breeze, listening to the ocean rather than their argument. The thin barrier between our suites had become a metaphor for their entire relationship, fragile, permeable, and ultimately unable to shield them from truth. Jonathan joined me for a quiet drink in one of the smaller lounges. We spoke little of them that evening. Instead, we discussed books we had both enjoyed, places we hoped to visit in the future, and the strange freedom that sometimes follows upheaval. There was no romantic tension between us, only the solid comfort of mutual respect. Two people who had given decades to their marriages now discovering they could still stand tall on their own. By day 5, the change in Michael and Brooke was unmistakable. They moved through the ship with diminished energy, their touches fewer, their conversations briefer. The luxury suite, the private butler, the romantic excursions no longer shielded them from the consequences of their choices. Michael was beginning to understand that chasing youth came at the cost of everything he had built. Brooke was learning that a married man's attention, however flattering, carried heavy baggage. The slow pressure had done its work. The fantasy was no longer sustainable, and formal night looming just ahead would bring everything into even sharper focus under the chandeliers and evening attire. Formal night transformed the ship into a world of polished elegance. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above starched white tablecloths. Silverware gleamed under warm lighting, and the gentle strains of a live string quartet filled the grand dining room. Men wore tuxedos, women moved in flowing gowns, and the air carried notes of fine perfume, aged wine, and the faint salt of the sea. It was the kind of evening designed for celebration and romance. For Michael and Brooke. It would become something else entirely. I chose the deep emerald gown I had packed with intention. It fit perfectly, skimming my figure with quiet sophistication. I added simple diamond earrings Michael had given me on our 25th anniversary and swept my hair into an elegant updo. Standing before the mirror in the owner's suite, I studied my reflection. The woman looking back had lines earned over 52 years of life, laughter, worry, strength. I was not competing with youth. I was presenting truth. Jonathan met me outside the dining room entrance. He looked distinguished in his black tuxedo, the silver at his temples catching the light. We entered together and were seated at a large round table set for 6. The extra chairs made our position impossible to avoid. We ordered champagne and spoke softly about the menu, the string quartet's repertoire, and the beauty of the night sky visible through the large windows. Our calm felt deliberate, anchored. Michael and Brooke arrived 10 minutes later. He wore a classic tuxedo that usually made him look commanding. Tonight it seemed slightly too large, as if the week had worn him down. Brooke's red gown was stunning, but her posture lacked its earlier confidence. When the maitre d' led them to the only remaining seats directly across from us, Michael stopped mid-step. Brooke's hand tightened on his arm. For a heartbeat, the entire room seemed to narrow to our table. Other passengers chatted and laughed around us, unaware of the silent earthquake happening in their midst. Michael recovered first, guiding Brooke into her chair with forced composure. His eyes met mine, regret, frustration, and something like resignation flickering across his face. "Good evening," I said evenly, lifting my champagne flute in a small gesture. Jonathan offered a polite nod. The meal began with surface-level politeness. The waiter poured wine. Courses arrived in elegant succession: chilled lobster bisque, fresh Caesar salad, and perfectly seared filet mignon. Conversation stayed carefully neutral at first. The weather in the islands, the ship's itinerary, the quality of the service. But beneath every word lay the accumulated weight of the week. Halfway through the main course, I reached into my small evening clutch and placed a thick envelope in the center of the table. The crisp white paper stood out against the fine china. Michael stared at it as if it might bite him. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low. "Clarity," I replied, "since you seem to have trouble finding it on your own." He opened the envelope with stiff fingers. Inside were printed copies of the cruise confirmation credit card statements from his business account emails between him and Brooke, and a letter from my attorney outlining the financial separation I had already set in motion. Jonathan slid a similar folder toward Brooke. She opened it slowly, her manicured nails trembling slightly against the pages. The color drained from both their faces. Around us, laughter rose from neighboring tables while ours fell into heavy silence. Brooke's eyes welled, but she blinked rapidly, refusing to let tears fall in public. Michael's jaw worked as he scanned the documents, his earlier defenses crumbling under the printed evidence. "You've been planning this," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," I corrected calmly. "You planned the cruise. I simply decided not to disappear from it." Jonathan spoke directly to Brooke, his surgeon's voice steady and precise. "You told me it was a girls' trip. I believed you because I trusted you. These papers show exactly how much that trust cost." Brooke looked smaller in her elegant gown. "I never meant for it to go this far," she murmured. "It started as excitement. You were always working, Jonathan. Michael made me feel seen." Jonathan's expression remained composed, though I saw the muscle in his cheek tighten. Being seen shouldn't require destroying 2 marriages. Michael turned to me, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "Laura, we can fix this. When we get home." "When we get home," I interrupted gently but firmly, "the locks will be changed. Your things will be packed. The divorce papers are already prepared." 28 years, Michael. You chose to throw them away on a luxury suite and stolen moments. Now you face the consequences with the same dignity I've shown all week. The string quartet shifted into a softer melody. Servers moved gracefully around us, refilling glasses and clearing plates, as if nothing extraordinary was happening. The contrast made the moment even more powerful. No shouting, no public scene, just 4 adults facing the wreckage of their choices under elegant chandeliers. Brooke pushed her plate away, appetite gone. "I want to leave the table." "Not yet," Jonathan said quietly. "Finish the evening. You both wanted this fantasy. At least have the courage to sit through its ending." We remained for dessert, rich chocolate soufflé and coffee served in delicate porcelain. Conversation had died completely. Michael stared at his plate. Brooke kept her eyes down. Jonathan and I finished our meal with the same measured grace we had maintained since boarding. When the waiter cleared the final plates, I stood. "Enjoy the rest of your night," I said. My voice carried no triumph, only finality. Jonathan rose beside me. We walked out of the dining room together, leaving Michael and Brooke frozen at the table behind us. The corridor outside felt cooler, the distant sound of the ocean a steady companion. I paused at the railing on the promenade deck, the warm night breeze brushing my skin. Jonathan stood beside me. "That was enough," he said. "Yes," I agreed. "More than enough." Through the windows I could see them still sitting there, 2 people who had entered the room glowing with secret excitement, now facing the full weight of reality. The fantasy had not survived formal night. The reckoning had arrived, delivered not with anger, but with the quiet, devastating force of composure and truth. Tomorrow the ship would turn toward Miami. The cruise was nearly over, but the real journey, the one back to ourselves, was only beginning. The final morning dawned clear and bright as the ship glided back into Miami harbor. From my balcony I watched the familiar skyline emerge through the haze, the city waiting to receive us all back into ordinary life. I packed with the same careful precision I had used at the start of the trip. No rushed movements, no lingering sentimentality, just the quiet closing of one chapter. In the corridor, the door to cabin 1026 opened as I stepped out. Michael emerged with heavy eyes and a suitcase that seemed heavier than when he arrived. Brooke followed her usual vibrancy, muted sunglasses, hiding what I suspected were tired eyes. For a moment the 4 of us stood in the same narrow space where the week had begun. No one spoke. Jonathan appeared from the stairs and joined me without a word. The silence said everything necessary. We disembarked separately, but in the same flow of passengers. Michael tried once more on the gangway, his voice low and strained. "Laura, please, we can still work through this." I met his gaze steadily. "The time for working through things was before you booked the owner's suite. Now it's time for separate paths." He nodded once defeated and walked away with Brooke trailing behind. Jonathan and I continued toward the terminal without looking back. The fantasy cruise had ended exactly as it deserved, quietly, with dignity intact for those who had preserved it. The divorce proceedings moved with surprising efficiency. My attorney had prepared everything in advance, and Michael, perhaps exhausted by the week at sea, chose not to contest the major terms. I kept our primary residence and a fair settlement that reflected 28 years of contribution to our family and his success. He retained the lake house. We both agreed to support Emily and Tyler without involving them in unnecessary conflict. Our daughter in Austin expressed quiet disappointment, but respected our decision to handle it privately. Tyler simply asked if I was okay. I told him I was better than okay. Brooke and Jonathan separated with similar discretion. She moved to another city shortly afterward. I never asked for details, and Jonathan offered none. Some endings do not require further examination. 6 months later, I stood on the balcony of my new waterfront condo, a sleek, sunlit space with fewer rooms, but far more peace. The big house had sold quickly. I had kept only the pieces that truly mattered: family photos, a few favorite books, the desk where I now wrote more often. Morning light danced across the bay as sailboats moved lazily in the distance. I held a cup of coffee, breathing in the salt air, and realized how light I felt. The cruise had not destroyed me. It had stripped away illusion and handed me clarity I hadn't known I needed. I traveled to Italy for 3 weeks in the spring, walking cobblestone streets and eating alone at small cafes without apology. I joined a watercolor class and a book club filled with women navigating their own transitions. My days filled with gentle purpose: gardening on the small terrace, long walks along the water, occasional lunches with new friends. Jonathan and I stayed in touch, not as lovers but as two people who had survived the same storm. We met for dinner every couple of months when our schedules aligned. There was comfort in our conversations, a shared shorthand no one else could understand. He had thrown himself back into surgery with renewed focus, while I discovered parts of myself that had been quietly waiting for space to breathe. Romance might come someday, or it might not. For now, the freedom felt like the greatest luxury of all. Sometimes late at night I think about that owner's suite and the thin walls that separated our realities. I remember the look on Michael's face in the dining room when our eyes first met. I remember Brooke's youthful confidence cracking under the weight of consequence. Most of all, I remember the power of choosing calm over chaos. In a world that rewards dramatic reactions, there is profound strength in refusing to lose yourself. Michael wanted an escape. Instead, he received a mirror. I wanted honesty. In delivering it with composure, I reclaimed not just my dignity but my future. The woman who boarded that ship as Michael Harrington's wife returned as Laura Harrington, whole, capable, and finally truly free. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever faced betrayal and wondered whether grace or anger serves you better, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell me in the comments, how would you have handled that moment in the dining room? Where are you listening from right now? Have you ever discovered strength you didn't know you possessed during life's hardest chapters? Your stories matter. They remind others that they are not alone in the quiet battles fought behind closed doors and elegant facades. We share these experiences not for revenge, but for the hope and resilience they can inspire. If you found value in this journey, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Thank you for listening.